الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر، أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، أشهد أن محمد رسول الله، أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة، حي على الصلاة، حي على الفلاح، حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة، قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر، لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله استغفر الله استغفر الله. لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم. اللهم صل على سيدنا الله.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We will have Sheikh Ammar's family lecture starting right after the Sunnah, inshallah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ما بعد اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا وتوفيقا برحمتك ومحض فضلك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم يسر ولا تعسر وتمم بالخير وبك نستعين يا فتاح وبك نستعين. So as always, we begin by thanking and praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing us to get through what is now almost half of Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow the next half of Ramadan to be even more blissful and to be even more beneficial. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to grow even more in the second half of Ramadan than we did in the first half, inshaAllah ta'ala. So last week we said that we were going to discuss fasting, right? Last week we began talking about last week we spoke about the spiritual dimensions of fasting. And before we spoke about the spiritual dimensions of fasting, we spoke about the 5 pillars of Islam. And we spoke about how each of the 5 pillars enable something, right? The same way you have like a pillar of a building and it keeps the building, erect. The same way you have these 5 pillars of Islam that keep Islam erect. So we spoke about how each of these 5 pillars enable something. We spoke about how each of the 5 pillars has a vision for the individual, a vision for the community. So we spoke about fasting and zakat and hajj and salah, and how each of these 4 things rectify an individual and also society. It organizes a society in a particular way, and it also organizes a person's life as well at an individual level. And then we spoke about how each of the 4 pillars of Islam, they have inner dimensions and they have outer dimensions. So when it came to fasting last week, we looked at the spiritual dimensions of fasting, which are the inner dimensions of fasting. So we spoke about how fasting, so this is what we spoke about last week. There's a couple of discussions that we're going to look at, but just to recap with the spiritual dimensions. So we spoke about this right here, the 5 pillars of Islam. And we spoke about the objectives that these 4 pillars here, besides the declaration of faith and shahada, we spoke about how they're trying to organize society in a particular way and how they're supposed to bring guidance to a person's life at an individual level. So this is what we spoke about last week. And if you look at the bottom here, it says fiqh, and then under declaration of faith it says theology. This is because these 4 pillars, salah, zakah, hajj, saum, they come under the domain of fiqh. And that's basically the subject area in which they're studied, whereas the shahada is studied in theology, right? So this is actually one of the reasons why theology is studied prior to fiqh, because theology lays the ground for fiqh. How so? Because when you study the rulings of zakah, saum, zakat, salah, saum, and hajj, you're making basic assumptions, right? You're assuming certain things. You're assuming that, one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. You're assuming the Prophet of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You're assuming the integrity of the text. Now, none of these assumptions are discussed in these 4, you can say, subjects, in the domain of fiqh. Where they are studied are in the domain of theology. So anyone who wants to discuss the underlying assumptions of fiqh, they'll have to study theology. This is why if you go to any reputable Islamic institution, they'll begin with a study of theology before the study of fiqh. Because theology lays the groundwork for fiqh to then build and grow. So we looked at the 5 pillars last week. The main discussions we had were the inner, outer dimensions, and I mentioned that each of them has a vision for the individual, a vision for society. And then we spoke about the objectives of fasting, the inner dimensions of fasting, and I quoted this quote right here that you see on the screen by the great reformist scholar of South Asia, Shah Waliullah of Delhi. We spoke about how man has this angelic side to him, and he has this animalistic side to him. And what fasting does is, by suppressing your basic human desires, you're able to live like a human. Because a human, you're given this caution, right? You're able to live your life opposing your desires. So when you suppress your nafs, this separates and distinguishes you from an animal now, right? Because you're not living your life the same way an animal lives his life. So this is one of the objectives, the inner spiritual objectives of fasting, is to suppress the nafs, right? By restricting us from eating and drinking and these, basic things that humans do. And by doing this, you create this capacity in you now to restrict yourself from doing other things, right? That are not as basic as eating and drinking. So now you have the capacity to restrain yourself from sinning. You have the capacity now to restrain yourself from even permissible things, right? Permissible things. So this is what fasting does. Fasting creates that capacity in you to live like a human, how you're supposed to be living in line with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commands and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's obligations. This is and we discussed the verse here in Surah Baqarah, the verse on fasting, that Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun. Right? So the objective behind fasting is so you can create a heightened awareness in your life of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the month of Ramadan, for 1 month, you restricted yourself from eating and drinking and all these things. Now post Ramadan, you have the capacity to stay away from even permissible things. You have the capacity to stay away from sinning. You have the capacity of staying away from the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes and that He's prohibited. And then you spoke about this hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. Fasting, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that fasting is for me. As-sawmu li wa ana ajzi bi, and I will reward the fasting person. And we spoke about last week why that's the case. Why specific to fasting? Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say that I'll reward the person who fasts? Allah rewards us for all of our good deeds, not just fasting. But when it comes to fasting, He says, Ana ajzi bih. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward the fasting person, will reward a fasting person in a way He doesn't reward, the person who prays and the person who gives zakat and the person who performs hajj. All of these things can be quantified, meaning their reward, the ajr, can be quantified. But when it comes to Sawm, it can't be quantified. There's no number to it. And the reason why Allah didn't put a number to it, we spoke about this last week, possible reasons why. So one was the issue of sabr, right? Fasting requires a degree of sabr that other acts of worship don't. Fasting is both a positive action and a negative action. You're doing something and you're also restricting yourself from doing something. So this is something which is very unique to fasting. And other forms of worship, they don't share in the same quality. So this is in regards to spiritual inner dimensions of fasting. As Muslims, we shouldn't just know the spiritual dimensions and the inner dimensions of each act of our ibadah. We should also know the basic fiqh, which is the outer dimensions of the act of worship. The outer dimensions of the act of worship is basically the fiqh. The fiqh are the basic rulings of how to perform a valid act of worship. Now this is something that has to be normalized in our communities. The study of fiqh is something that has to be popularized. It's something that has to be disseminated. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it obligatory upon you to fast, then by definition, it's now also necessary for you to learn the basic rulings that will help you perform a valid fast. So when fasting is known as ilmul hal, when something becomes obligatory upon you, now it's your job to go and seek out the knowledge to perform the act in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants it to be performed. This is what fiqh is. Fiqh is learning how to live your life in accordance to Allah's will, Allah's desire. So you worship Allah how He wants to be worshipped, not how we want to worship Him. Because if Allah had left it to us, the reality is that we wouldn't be worshipping Allah, we'd be worshipping our own nafs. If Allah said pray, and that's all He said, aqimu salah, many of us would not pray unless we really needed to. What does that mean, really needed to? Meaning like if we were like in a position now where Allah is like taking everything away in our life and we have no material things to go to, right? then we'll resort to salah, right? It'll take a back seat in our life. So if had Allah left the acts of ibadah to ourselves, then we wouldn't be worshipping Allah, we'd be worshipping ourselves. So fiqh is very important because fiqh teaches us how to worship Allah properly, how He wants to be worshipped. And this is actually an intersection between two different disciplines, fiqh and tasawwuf. Fiqh and tasawwuf. Because fiqh, it regulates your behavior, it regulates your actions. And by regulating your actions, you're doing things in a way where perhaps you don't want to do it, you're suppressing your nafs. So by living your life according to fiqh, you're taming your nafs as well at the same time. So there's a huge intersection there between fiqh and tasawwuf. And the ulama, they speak about this in a lot of detail. But anyways, the reason I mention this is because to create this incentive to study fiqh. Many of us have fasted many Ramadans, and perhaps we have not been given the opportunity yet to look at the basic rulings of fasting. So over the next 3 weeks, this is what I want to do. So last week we looked at spiritual dimensions. We got 3 more weeks, today and 2 more. So we'll look at the basic rulings of fasting, which is basically the outer dimensions of fasting. And the discussions will revolve around, number 1, we'll speak about the definition of fasting, and then we'll speak about the invalidators, what invalidates the fast, and then we'll speak about those who are exempt from fasting along with the expiations, if a person does break their fast in a particular way. And then if we have time, then we'll also look at the issue of moon sighting and also i'tikaf, although that's not a priority at the moment. So without further ado, inshallah, we will look at the first discussion. Today we'll look at the definition of fasting, and then next week we'll look at the other discussions, inshallah. So we'll take it slowly. If you guys have any questions during the presentation, you guys are free to put your hands up and ask, and I'll inshallah answer on the spot. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let's look at the definition of fasting. Definitions are very important. Definitions are very important because if you don't define what you're talking about, then you can't make a judgment about it. If you don't know what you're talking about, then how could you, affirm or negate something about the thing you're talking about? So this is a basic sort of principle we have in our faith. It's mentioned in the discipline of logic that al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. Propositional knowledge presupposes conceptual knowledge. So if you don't know what you're talking about, then you can't be making judgments about that thing. Right? This is a common problem in our society. It's a common problem in our society where people talk about things that they haven't defined. They haven't defined their terms. Right? We see this all the time in Western media. Right? They want to talk about Islam, but they're not going to define Islam first. So the Islam they're talking about is not the Islam we're talking about. So we're speaking past each other, not speaking to each other. So definitions are very important. So when it comes to fasting, before we can say that this is permissible, this is not permissible, you have to know what fasting is, right? You have to know the definition. So when it comes to definitions, you have like a linguistic definition, you have a technical definition. Linguistic definition of fasting, linguistically means to abstain, and it means to refrain. It means to abstain, it means to refrain. Sawma yasumu. So sawm was actually a word that was used even before Islam. The Arabs, when they would train their horses for warfare, they call them hisan sa'ima. What they do is they'll deprive the horse of food and water, so that way it will create that capacity that when it goes out for war, it can stay away from food and water for a very long period of time, because it's not guaranteed when they're traveling if they'll find food or water. So they call these horses hisan sa'ima. The idea being is that they've trained these horses to abstain and to refrain from its basic necessities. So this is what fasting means linguistically. Sama yasumu, the verb, it means to abstain, it means to refrain. So now you can sort of get an idea now what the connection between the linguistic and the technical definition will be. So you have a linguistic definition, you have something called a technical definition, also known as a legal definition. So this is a definition that's particular to a particular discipline or science. So like for example, like salah, right? Salah has a linguistic definition which just means to supplicate. But when you talk about salah, we're talking about it in like a very specific sense, right? It's specific body movements with specific things that are recited, and it's a specific way to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's like a technical understanding of salah. So same thing with fasting, right? Fasting has a linguistic meaning to it, and it also has a technical meaning to it. So this is a technical definition of fasting. If you guys want to take pictures of the slides, you guys are free to do so. So it means to actually or legally abstain from the invalidators from dawn until sunset with its intention from somebody who's required to fast. It's a bit of a mouthful, but this is how technical definitions work. Technical definitions, they try to convey a very specific meaning. So it's going to try to include things and exclude things at the same time. So fasting isn't just to refrain. There's something called actually refraining, and there's something called legally refraining. We're going to speak about that in the next slide. So actually or legally abstain from the invalidators. The invalidators we'll look at next week. From dawn until sunset, with its intention from somebody who's required to fast. This is the technical definition of fasting. So anyone who studies fiqh, and they open up a book of fiqh to the book of fasting, the chapter on fasting, this is the technical definition that they'll find. So we're going to break this definition down in today's presentation. So, as I mentioned, abstaining is of two types. You have something called actually abstaining, and you have something called legally abstaining. What does it mean to actually abstain? To actually abstain means you actually, in reality, avoid the things that will invalidate the fast. What does it mean to legally abstain? What this means is that you've done something which in actuality has invalidated your fast, but the Sharia, yani the law, excuses you, and because of that, according to the Sharia, you're still fasting, you're still in a state of fasting. So this happens when a person forgets that they're fasting. So a person who forgets that they're fasting and they eat, that person has not broken their fast. This is according to a hadith that's mentioned by Imam al-Bukhari. It's also mentioned by Imam Muslim in their hadith collections that man nasiya wa huwa sa'imun فَأَكَلَ أَوْ شَرِبَ فَلْيُتِمَّ صَوْمَهُ فَإِنَّمَا أَطْعَمَهُ اللَّهُ وَسَقَاهُ. The one who forgetfully eats or drink in a state of fasting, let that person complete their fast, because it was Allah who gave them food and drink. So the person who forgets to fast, forgets that they're fasting and eats or drinks, is not conscious of the fact that they're fasting. And because of this, the Sharia excuse this person. So even though in actuality they haven't abstained from the invalidators, but legally, according to the Sharia, from a Sharia perspective, from a law perspective, they're still in a state of fasting. So this is what it means to abstain. It could be in actuality or it could be legally. And it says here that the main difference between forgetfulness and an accident is that in the latter case, one is conscious of the fact that they're fasting. So you'll see in next week's lesson, when we look at the invalidators, a person can break the fast in three ways: either forgetfully, accidentally, or deliberately. And each of them have their own rulings. The difference between someone who forgetfully breaks their fast and accidentally breaks their fast is that a person who accidentally breaks their fast is conscious of the fact that they're fasting. And because of the fact that they were conscious of the fact that they're fasting, there's going to be a makeup for that, for the fast. So your fast will break. Whereas if a person forgetfully breaks their fast, they weren't conscious of the fact that they're fasting, and because of that there's no qada, there's no makeup. So this is what it means to abstain. It could be in actuality, it means both actuality, or also legally, meaning from a Sharia perspective. Does that make sense up until here? Bismillah. So next part of the definition says from dawn until sunset. You know, you probably wouldn't think much of this, like it's very obvious, from dawn until sunset, right? When the Fajr time sets in until Maghrib. What does it actually mean from dawn? Because this is a point of contention. And it's something that we should know. Because when we pick up calendars, right, Ramadan calendars, some calendars mention different timings for when you should stop eating, right? So some calendars were mentioned like an earlier time, and some calendars were mentioned a later time. So what does this go back to? So it goes back to this part of the definition here, from dawn until sunset. So anyone who studied the fiqh of salah will have studied the prayer times, mawaqitu salah. And part of the discussion on prayer times is going to be a discussion on when Fajr time sets in. So many of you may not know this, but how is Fajr time determined? Right? It's determined by observation. right? You observe, Fajr time sets in at what we call a subh sadiq, the true dawn, the true dawn. But when does that true dawn actually occur? When does it occur? So if you, different parts of the world, if you go to different parts of the world and you try to observe this with the naked eye, or even with the help of telescopes and whatnot, you'll observe in different places, under different climate conditions, under different environments, you'll observe different, there'll be different results basically. And this is why when it came to when the Fajr time sets in, there's been different observations in different parts of the world. So you have something called degrees, right? They talk in degrees. People who do, who calculate these salah times, they talk in degrees. And the degrees, what the degrees are basically the degree that the sun is below the horizon. So you have something called 18 degrees, 15 degrees, 12 degrees. And the lower you get, the closer the sun gets to the horizon. So then when does Fajr time set in? Some of the scholars in South Asia, they've observed 18 degrees in South Asia. So they're seeing that the Subh Sadiq, the true dawn, is happening at when the sun is 18 degrees below the horizon. Whereas this is something that hasn't been authenticated in this part of the world. Like in this part of the world, no scholar has seen the sun, the true dawn happening at 18 degrees below the horizon. It's usually a bit later, 15 degrees, or somewhere around there, maybe, yeah, it's usually around 15 degrees. So most of the calendars we'll see in this part of the world, they'll, Fajr time, according to them, will set in at 15 degrees, so that'll be a bit of a later time. Some calendars do 18 degrees, so it's going to be an earlier time, right? So it goes back to this verse of the Quran here. وَكُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَكُمُ الْخَيْطُ الْأَبْيَضُ مِنَ الْخَيْطِ الْأَسْوَدِ. Our Prophet says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that eat and drink until the white thread of dawn becomes distinct to you from the black thread of night. But what's actually meant by become distinct? Because depending on where you live, your observations and the results will be different. So in this part of the world, most of the masajid will do 15 degrees. 15 degrees mean the sun being 15 degrees below the horizon. This is when the white thread of dawn becomes distinct from the black thread of the night. So that will be a bit of a later time. The scholars mentioned that caution, if you want to take caution, then you should stop eating at 18 degrees, which is a bit of an earlier time, but pray your salah at 15. So that way, this guarantee, and you're certain of the fact that you're not eating into Fajr time, and you're also certain of the fact that Fajr time set in. So you stop eating at 18, and then you pray your salah 15, like this. So this will be caution. So this is a discussion. It's a very lengthy discussion. For those who are interested in it, there's an excellent book written by Dr. Asim Yusuf in the UK, who has written a very thick monograph on this issue, and he observed the timings for Fajr for about 2 years in the UK, and he never observed 18 degrees. It was always somewhere between like 15 and 12. The book is called Shedding Light on the Dawn. Is what the book is called, Shedding Light on the Dawn, by Dr. Asim Yusuf. It's a very helpful resource. He also speaks about Isha time. So again, this conundrum happens with the beginning of Isha as well. Beginning of Fajr, beginning of Isha. So when does Isha time set in? It sets in when the Shafaq disappears. But what does it mean for the Shafaq, that light, to disappear? Again, depending on where you live, under the climate conditions and so on, you'll get different observational results. So this is why some places they pray Isha at a later time, and some masajid pray Isha at an earlier time. Right? It's a difference of observation. Nevertheless, inshallah, they're both valid scholarly opinions, but if you want to take caution when it comes to fasting in particular, then you should stop eating a bit earlier and pray Fajr a bit later. That would be caution. So this is the second part of the definition. So one was to actually legally abstain from the invalidators. The invalidators we'll look at next week, inshallah, from dawn until sunset. So now you guys know that there's some difference of opinion here. So now when you guys pick up calendars, you guys know, where this difference of opinion is stemming from. It's good to have knowledge of these things. Okay, the third part of the definition mentions something about intentions. Intentions. Now we know that intentions are are essential to our faith. The famous hadith of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Innama al-a'malu bin-niyyat." actions are based on intentions. What does it mean by actions are based on intentions? Is it talking about the reward for the action? Is it talking about the validity of the action? Or is it talking about like the spiritual effects of the action? Many of the ulama mention it's talking about the validity of the action. Meaning action, an act of ibadah is not an act of ibadah unless the active intention is made that this is an act of ibadah. So for example, when you get up to pray, if you don't make the intention that you're praying salah, it might just be like another form of yoga, right? So this is what differentiates like habitual acts from acts of worship. Al-'ada min al-ibadah. Right? An-niyya is basically what distinguishes the two. So a person who has a habit of eating before sunrise and not eating rest of the day until sunset, if that person doesn't make the intention of fasting, that person is not fasting. According to the Sharia, that person is not fasting. So intentions are very important. They distinguish habitual acts from acts of ibadah. So when it comes to intentions, it depends on what the fast is. So with some fasts, you have to make the intention before Fajr time sets in. And with other fasts, you have the leeway of making the intention up until Dhuhr time, up until what we call the Islamic midday, when the sun is at its zenith, at the meridian point before it declines. You have the leeway of making intention even at that point. It depends on what the fast is. And I'll mention why there's a difference of opinion on this. So when it comes to fasts that are make-up, meaning they're qada fast, you have to make the intention at night, meaning before Fajr time sets in. If it's an expiatory fast, meaning a fast of kafara, again, you have to make the intention at night. But when it comes to Ramadan fast, and it comes to some of the nawafil fasts, you can make the intention up until the Islamic midday. So this is the timings here. Maghrib to Fajr, Maghrib to Islamic midday. Now why is that the case? That's the case because it's an issue of specification. Arabic is called taqsis. If the lawgiver, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He specifies the fast, and He says that you have to fast in this particular month, like in Ramadan, or you have to fast 10th of Ashura, or Mondays, Thursdays. So these are all specified by the lawgiver. Any fast that's specified by the lawgiver, you have the leeway of making an intention most of the day, and that points to the Islamic midday. So if you guys look at this right here, you guys can see. So when does the time set in? When does the day begin? It begins at Fajr. When does it end? It begins at sunset. So the midday is basically between Fajr and Maghrib, which is like at Dhuhr time. So if the fast is specified by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Shari' Himself, then you have the leeway of delaying your intention. So for example, you go to sleep at Fajr time in the Ramadan, you didn't make the intention tomorrow I'm fasting. You have up until basically Dhuhr time sets in to make that intention. And you're not supposed to make the intention at the beginning of the month for the rest of the month. It's not how an act of ibadah works. You can't make an intention. Your intention is not legally considered until the actual time for that act of ibadah sets in. So for example, you can't make an intention that right now at Dhuhr time, that every Dhuhr I pray for the rest of my life, I'm making the intention that it's for Dhuhr. Because you can't make the intention for Dhuhr until Dhuhr time sets in. You can't make the intention for Isha until Isha time sets in. So you can't make the intention for the fast until the time for that fast sets in. So every day we should be renewing our intentions before we go to sleep or before we read Salatul Fajr, that today I'm fasting this particular fast of Ramadan. Usually the Islamic calendars that we pick up, they have like a, what do you call it? Not a dua. It's بِصَوْمِ غَرٍ نَوَيْتُ مِنْ شَهْرِ Ramadan. It's not a dua, it's an intention. Right? So this isn't something that the Prophet ﷺ tells us, like in these particular words. But this is the intention that you're supposed to make. بِصَوْمِ غَرٍ نَوَيْتُ. I make the intention of fasting tomorrow in the month of Ramadan. The other dua, which is dua of breaking the fast, that is a ma'thur dua. It's a dua that's been transmitted from our Prophet ﷺ. So intentions. Intentions are very important. If the fast has been specified by the lawgiver, then you have the leeway of making the intention up until Islamic midday. If the intention is specified by you, so for example, you take a vow that I'm going to fast next Friday. So that fast is now specified by you. not by the lawgiver. So you don't have the leeway of basically making intention up until the Islamic midday. You have to make the intention before Salatul Fajr sets in, before the time for Fajr sets in. Does that make sense up until here? Yeah. Yeah.
If somebody's waking up for suhoor
Mhm.
and and that the intention is that they're going to fast, not in the sense like from a words perspective,
Yeah.
right? But they are just waking up. Would that be considered, or
Mhm.
you have to say those words?
No, so the verbalization, so that's what it's called. It's a verbalization
Yes.
of an intention. So the actual intention is the intention of the heart, right? Is the intention, is this thing that's in your heart, in your mind. And verbalizing it is just a way to manifest or to express what you have already expressed to yourself, like inside. So you don't need to verbalize it. So when you wake up for suhoor, obviously you're waking up with the intention that tomorrow I'm going to fast. So this will suffice as an intention. Inshallah. Any other questions?
If sisters have any questions, I can get you guys a mic.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this hadith, Sheikh, that I fairly remember, so maybe I'm wrong here. So Rasulullah would come and ask one of his wife, our mother, so if there is anything to eat, if there is nothing to eat, then he would make it, and then I'm fasting. That probably is during some time in the day and not necessarily one of the obligatory fasts. So is that, I hope that's the right recollection that I had. How does that fit into this, if that's correct?
Yeah. So the question is that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would, wake up, probably it might be past Dhuhr, and he'll ask his wives if there's any food to eat or drink, and they'll reply in the negative that there's no food and drink, and then he'll just say, okay, I'm going to fast. That doesn't necessarily negate anything we've mentioned here, because when he sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that I'm going to fast, what he meant, and this is one of the interpretations given by the ulama, is that what he meant was that I'm going to refrain. What he meant was it like in a linguistic sense, that I'm going to refrain from eating and drinking for rest of the day. It wasn't necessarily in the legal understanding of what fasting is. So when he said that I'm going to fast the rest of the day, he could have just meant it in like a linguistic sense, that I'm not going to eat and drink for the rest of the day. Right? So that's one understanding of the hadith. Also, there might be some exceptions made for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Him being the Sharia, him also being a source of law. There might be some rulings that apply to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that don't apply to the rest of his ummah. Right? So there's also one understanding of that hadith. But nevertheless, the fiqh is, and the default is that you make an intention, depending on what the fast is. If it's specified by the lawgiver, then before Salatul Dhuhr. If it's not specified by the lawgiver, then before Salatul Fajr. No. Any other questions?
Well, the 18 to 15 degrees, like on our calendar has, 5 minutes before. If you wake up late, is it better to not eat suhoor because you missed the imsak time, or is it better to just defer and just say, okay, I still have till Fajr time to eat?
So you're saying if you wake up late.
You wake up late, but you still have time before Fajr starts, but the imsak time's already passed,
Oh,
the
okay.
5-minute window.
Mhm. The thing is, look, it depends on where you live. In many places, in many parts of the world, there's not going to be a big difference between the 15 and 18 degrees. It might be an issue of maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But then you go to other parts of the world, and it might be a whole hour or even 2 hours, right? So that's when things become a bit problematic. 10, 15 minutes is not a big deal, right? And I mean, how much, if you sleep in, you're going to sleep in maybe probably more than 10, 15 minutes. But if you wake up past the imsak time and there's still time for Fajr time to set in, I mean, they're both valid scholarly opinions, and just depends on your level of cautious, right? How cautious you want to be. Otherwise, it's going to be a valid fast, inshallah. No. Any other questions? there's one last part of the definition that I'm going to look at before we wrap up for, today's session. So the definition mentions from someone who's required to fast. So fasting is to refrain legally, is to actually or legally abstain from the invalidators from dawn until sunset with its intention from someone who's required to fast. From someone who's required to fast. What does it mean by someone who's required to fast? There's two types of conditions. Many of us have never thought of this like this, but the ulama, they delve into these types of nuances, which is something for us to appreciate. There's something called general condition, there's something called specific conditions. So general conditions relate to the obligation, specific conditions relate to validity of the act. So general conditions are those conditions that now make the particular act of ibadah, obligatory upon you. So now it's like in your dues, like in your metaphysical, you can say, bucket of duties that you have to now sort of execute. Okay? So anyone who is Muslim, who's sane, who's an adult, fasting is going to be obligatory upon you. Okay? That's the default. Specific conditions are conditions for validity. So a person, this would include things like having an intention, right? If you don't have an intention, so fasting is obligatory upon you, so you met the general conditions, but you never met the specific conditions, you never made the intention, then the act is not going to be valid. So the general conditions relate to the thing being obligatory upon you, and the specific conditions relate to the act being valid, right? For women, being free from menstruation or lokia, right? So a woman, she might be Muslim, she might be sane, she might be an adult, right? But she's on her menses. Then in that case, fasting is obligatory upon her, but she's not able to perform the act in a manner which would be valid. So for that reason, she has to do qada. That's a default, that she would have to do qada, she'd have to make up the fast post-Ramadan. Same thing with salah. The reason she does qada is because she's met the general conditions. The reason why she makes the fast up is because she met the general conditions for obligation. Same thing with salah. But with salah, there's an exception because our Prophet ﷺ said we have a nas, or we have a text, we have proof, evidence from our Prophet ﷺ, him saying that a woman doesn't need to repeat the salah that she missed during her menses, right? We don't have a hadith like this when it comes to fasting. So the woman who meets the general conditions but doesn't meet the specific conditions, then post-Ramadan she'll make up the fast. Ideally before the next Ramadan. Ideally before the next Ramadan, because there's a difference of opinion between the madhahib, between the schools of fiqh. Like, these are the rulings I'm mentioning here are according to the Hanafi school of fiqh. There's not really any difference of opinion here. But when you get to like the invalidators and stuff, there might be some differences of opinion which I mentioned. But one of those differences of opinion comes when doing a qada, a woman making a fast before the next Ramadan. According to other madhahib, if she delays making those fasts up after the next Ramadan without an excuse, بِغَيْرِ عُذْر, without any like legally absolving excuse, then not only does she have to make up the fast, it's also fidya as well. Both. Whereas that's not the case according to the Hanafi school. Even if she deliberately delays her fast for like the next 5-6 years, she only has to make that fast up. There's only a qada. There's no fidya. And there's reasons why the Hanafis say this, but obviously this isn't the place to go into the evidences. Yeah.
Regarding fidya, is it in the family? What I've seen is some people who don't have the confidence because of age or health reasons, they want to in the family because of some age or health reasons. Some of the family members, they want to sign up for fidya because the money has to be given to somebody else, while they also fast in parallel. How does that work?
Save that question for when you get to a section on expiations. There's a whole section that's going to come up. If you guys see,
Going too fast.
Jumping the gun a bit here. So when you get to exemptions from fasting, there's going to be a section where we talk about the fidya. Yeah, we talk about the fidya here, then you can ask that question, inshallah. So, inshallah, we'll discuss fidya when we get to the section on fidya, inshallah. So that was the definition of fasting. Up until here, we just looked at the definition of fasting. So what was the definition of fasting? So we looked at 4 different aspects of the definition, right? To actually or legally abstain. So now you guys know what it means to actually legally abstain. You guys also know the difference now between linguistic and technical definition, between actually legally abstaining from dawn until sunset. So now you guys know where the difference of opinion comes with the whole Fajr time setting in, intention as well, and from someone who's required to fast. Someone who's required to fast in Arabic is known as mukallaf. Mukallaf. So basically what that means, taklif, is it means that they're morally obligated. What does it mean to be morally obligated? It means that now you have to perform that particular act. If you don't, there's a punishment. If you do, there's a reward. That's what it means to be morally obligated, mukallaf. And a person, the basic conditions for taklif are the ones that are mentioned under general conditions. If you're a Muslim, if you're sane, and if you're an adult, then generally speaking, you would be mukallaf. Meaning that now the Sharia, it requires you to do something particular. If you do it, you'll get a reward. If you don't, you'll be punished. That's what it means to be mukallaf. Being Muslim is a condition. Again, this is a difference of opinion, not between the schools of fiqh, between the schools of aqidah. So anyone who's in the future, perhaps, if you do any like in-depth class on fiqh, or theology, then you'll go into this discussion. There's a whole question, there's a whole difference of opinion whether a disbeliever is required to fast and pray and so on. No doubt they're required to believe in Allah, right, which are known as the usul. But are they required to believe and do the furu', which are like the particular acts as well? So on the Day of Judgment, is a disbeliever going to be punished just for not believing in Allah, or also for all the prayers they never prayed, all the fasts they never fasted, all the zakat they didn't give? So this is why you find some scholars say that you're not supposed to give anything haram to a disbeliever. Why? Because they're obligated to eat halal, according to some ulama. And they'll be asked on the Day of Judgment not only why they didn't believe in Allah, but also why they didn't eat halal. So this is why the ulama say that you shouldn't be giving haram food to disbelievers. Like if you gifted like wine from your co-worker, you're not supposed to go and give it to another, someone who drinks it. So this is a general point. Khair. Okay. Any other questions before we wrap up? So next week, inshallah, we'll continue with the presentation. We'll look at the invalidated expiations and also the people who are exempt from fasting. This is usually a discussion and the questions that come up, they usually pertain to these two discussions. Yeah.
One last question. When you say adult, is that the definition, is there age or any specific conditions?
Not age. A person is considered to be an adult according to Sharia when they reach the age of puberty, or when they reach puberty. So not the age of puberty, when they reach puberty. So when the signs of purity become, manifest on a person, that's when they're considered to be adult. So when we say adult, we don't mean 18 according to adult, according to whatever law is in the country. We're talking about when a person reaches puberty. Because now their intellect has developed in a way where they can make cautious choices for themselves, and not only that, but they can understand the implications of their choices. Any other questions before we wrap up? So inshallah next week and the week after we have 2 more Sundays. We'll look at the invalidators in expiations, and we'll look at those who are exempt from fasting, and also the fidya, the kafara. And if we have time, then we'll also look at the issue of moon sighting and why there's so much controversy over it, inshallah ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this beneficial. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to benefit from the remainder of Ramadan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amplify our good deeds. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amplify our good deeds. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to perform the acts of our ibadah in the month of Ramadan with presence and with sincere intentions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this Ramadan a Ramadan of growth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this blessed Ramadan bring this community together. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this community and all the excellent work that they're doing. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow this to weigh heavy for them on their book of deeds, in their book of deeds on the Day of Judgment. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Jazakumullah khair.